The Committee on Government Organization will come to order. The clerk will engage in a silent roll call. We do not appear to have a quorum here today, so we will forego approval of the minutes and bring that up at the next meeting. The first presenter we have is Paul Johansson, the Chief of Wildlife with the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources. An overview of agency management of wildlife management areas. And Colleen Scully with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with a presentation on aspects of federal funding. Is Chief Johansson here? Right there.
Good afternoon. It's indeed a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. We're going to do if it pleases the Joint Committee, we'd like to do a bit of a tag team in our presentation on both our wildlife management area program, which we're extraordinarily proud of here in West Virginia, as well as the strong partnership that we have with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in helping us to administer our work on a variety of efforts within the Division of Natural Resources, including our public lands management program. So what I'd like to do first is introduce Steve Rao, who's our Assistant Chief in charge of our game management program. And Steve will be giving you a very brief overview of our wildlife management area program. And then we'll transition into Colleen Scully's overview of the wildlife and sport fish restoration program.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Paul said, I'll give a brief overview of our WMA Wildlife Management Area program here in West Virginia. We have 112 wildlife management areas in the state, and this 112 includes our national forest management units across 3 national forests in the state. We have 99 of the WMAs that are either state-owned or we have license agreements with certain entities to manage those. This is a map that displays the distribution of our wildlife management areas across the state. And we have them pretty much from corner to corner and across the state, as you can see on this map. Statutory responsibility that the Wildlife Resources section has of the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources, we are responsible for the management and conservation of the state's wildlife resources and providing wildlife associated recreation. And the primary objective of the Wildlife Resources section is to maintain and perpetuate fish and wildlife at levels compatible with the available habitat, while providing maximum opportunities for recreation, research, and education. As part of this objective of the Wildlife Resources section, we conduct wildlife and habitat management activities on the state's wildlife management area system. Primary funding for these activities that we conduct come from the sale of hunting and fishing license, our annual hunting and fishing license sales, and also from the Wildlife and Sport Fishery Restoration Act. I will not go into much detail on that. Colleen is going to be presenting her talk on that aspect of it. And we also have funds that come in from NGOs, National Wild Turkey Federation, DU, Ducks Unlimited, various organizations like that will do projects on our wildlife management areas, provide funding to conduct projects, habitat management, and such like. Some of the things that on the wildlife management areas that are maintained are access roads and trails, information signs to be able to get the information out of activities that can and can't do on wildlife management areas. We have some campgrounds that provide camping for hunting and fishing related activities on some of the wildlife management areas. We have 31 public shooting ranges across the state. to provide access for public shooting. We have public use facilities on the WMAs. These include anything from parking lots to, in this case, the picture of the Class Q fishing area, boat facilities onto impoundments that are on some of the WMAs, anything like that allows and helps with the public access to our WMAs. We have what are called physically challenged hunter access roads on many of our WMAs. This allows access for folks that have Class Q license to be able to get into the areas to either be able to hunt, or on our Class Q impoundments to be able to fish. Main things that we do on our wildlife management areas is the habitat management. We do various and many things for habitat management on the areas across the state. What type of habitat is on a particular WMA will dictate some of the things we do. We have areas up in the northern panhandle that is primarily a farm game area, a lot of fields. So we do a lot of grassland management, farm game species, open land species, wildlife. And then we have, on the other end of the spectrum, we have a lot of WMAs that are heavily forested. So we focus on forest management for forest related wildlife. So we will create wildlife openings and clearings. These are very important for brood production, for an array of wildlife species, for feeding, for many different things that are required in their life cycles. We have constructed waterfowl ponds and wetlands. Wetland habitat is very important for many species of wildlife. So we do projects to create these types of habitats in areas on WMAs where it is conducive to that. We put out food plots, various different kinds of plants, whether that is clover to grains for wildlife, and specifically on many WMAs we put out what are called dove fields to provide opportunity for hunters to dove hunt on these areas. We create savannas on these. These are areas where we go in where it's conducive to be able to maintain them in a grassland, a forest landscape in grasses, and clear them with having residual trees in there, plant them to forbs, clover, bird's foot trefoil, any of those kind of things. And these are areas that are vitally important to species of wildlife that utilize these kind of forest openings. And also we do a lot of forest management in a state that is 80+% forested. That is, if you're going to do wildlife management, forest management is vitally important. So we do a lot of commercial timber sales, clearings, cutback borders along the edges of field, things like that, to create what is called early successional habitat, where you allow it to grow back up in sapling trees. And that is another type of habitat that, early successional wildlife species is a very important cadre of species of wildlife that is lacking habitat. Forests are growing up. And, we need to bring forests back into early successional habitat. Another thing that we do on these areas to maintain these types of, a lot of these, savannas, grasslands, the early successional forest land is prescribed fires, which are controlled fires, depending on the terrain, the climatic, winds, rain, the moisture contact, humidity, all those things are put into that. And this will set back succession, and keep that a way of keeping early successional, whether it's fields or in a woodland situation, keeping them in that young forest habitat, which, like I said, is very, very important for many wildlife species. As I said, this would be a very brief overview of our system, but wildlife management area system. Are there any questions at this time?
Senator Woodrum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are you in a position to speak about funding? Can you speak about funding? I mean, whether you're adequately funded for the wildlife management areas?
Yes.
You feel that you are adequately funded to maintain the roads?
Oh, I'm
and
sorry. I
docks
couldn't. It depends on what we are looking at doing. Whether there's adequate funds or not. License sales, we bring in license sales, and also with our federal dollars that come in.
Is there anything that the legislature would need to possibly look at to assist in this?
I would refer, as far as the wildlife resources section, I would refer to the chief for.
If I may, that's an excellent question. And I think the answer's simply, we could always use additional funds to put on the ground to enhance the work that we're involved in. At the present time, we are adequately funded to maintain our areas, but we continue to grow our wildlife management area program. It does tend to stretch our ability somewhat in terms of the generation of license revenue and our wildlife and sport fish restoration dollars. But I would say that generally speaking, we're in reasonably good financial condition because we tend to be very conservative in how we expend those dollars. Hope that answers your question.
Are your revenue streams stable, or are they in decline? Things like hunting licenses, those type of things.
Another great question. Our license sales are relatively stable at this point. We did go through much as many of our other state fish and wildlife agencies across the country did see a decline in hunting license in particular, and some fishing as well. Those declines appear to have stabilized. We are actively engaged in what we call recruitment, retention, and reactivation programs designed to bring hunters and boaters and anglers into the license buying public and reactivate those that may have dropped out. But that remains an important program for us and for other state fish and wildlife agencies across the country. And with regards to, and Colleen can talk more about this, but with regards to the wildlife and sport fish restoration dollars, we've seen a very steady increase and a bump in those dollars in a positive direction in recent years. A lot of that has to do with the sale of guns and ammunition.
In your areas that have campgrounds, how do you fund those?
Our campgrounds?
Yes.
So the wildlife resources section has very limited campgrounds. Campground capacity and numbers of campgrounds. They're designed and targeted specifically to try to meet the needs of hunters and anglers that come in. That they're not analogous at all to our sister agency in state parks. we're not primarily set up to provide camping opportunities for the general public. Our opportunities are fairly specific to, again, to those folks that are engaged in hunting and angling, and the funding for those campgrounds are administered through our license, through the revenue generated through our license sales.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from Kanawha.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How come there aren't any wildlife management areas in Kanawha, Boone, or Raleigh?
We're constantly looking for opportunities to fill those gaps in terms of public lands available for hunting and fishing. In Raleigh County, in Kanawha County, we most recently lost a wildlife management area that we had under a license agreement with a private company. They chose to go in a different direction. I will say that Kanawha State Forest is open to hunting and angling as well. I'm not sure about Raleigh County. Oh yeah, Walbeck is in a portion of Walbeck's in Kanawha County as well. But I can assure you that we're constantly looking for opportunities to provide additional wildlife associated public wildlife associated recreation through our public lands, our wildlife management area program. So most recently, we've had a very large expansion over in the western part of the state. Raleigh and Boone County and Kanawha County remain high on our list. Boone County will be announcing very shortly a major opportunity to develop a wildlife management area in the Madison area. That announcement should be coming probably in the first part of next year. A multi-faceted area that we're pretty excited about. So we're constantly looking for areas.
Okay, and this map, it says wildlife management areas. Does that include all of the campgrounds and the shooting ranges or is that something separate?
Yes, the wildlife management areas that have campgrounds on them, they would be included in that. And the same with the shooting ranges.
Okay.
That does not include, that map does not include state parks.
Sure,
So yes.
sure. And then the food plots, you said you grow food?
They're called food plots, and we plant, like I said, we'll plant various types of grains or clover for wildlife.
Okay,
That's the nomenclature that's tend to be sometimes used as a food plot. Yes.
okay. And then the forestry that you guys do you have your own set of foresters or do you use foresters?
Well, we have staff foresters, and we utilize them to do the marking, delineate timber, market, and sell it and everything. Yes.
Okay. How many foresters do you have?
We are currently looking at we have one staff forester right now, and we're looking at contracting to get 6 more. So we have one in each district. We'll have one in each of our DNR districts.
Okay. And do you work with forestry at all?
We do some, yes.
Okay.
As part of, agency to agency. But as far as the marking and we run that, because we're looking at it as wildlife habitat oriented activities for these timber sales.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
The further questions of the witness, the senator from Kanawha.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe to follow up on Senator Woodrum's question, what is your annual budget?
Annual budget?
Yeah. In dollars. He asked if you had sufficient funding, but what is your annual funding?
I just looked at the annual report this morning. I usually have that number committed to memory. I think it's right around 35 million. That includes revenue generated through license sales through our federal aid dollars. And then we also receive a significant amount of money based on royalty payments through oil and gas, as well as other timber sales, those types of dollars.
So your report mentioned, I guess, approximately 1.5 million acres. Is that property that is owned by the state? Is it federal property, or you mentioned, I think earlier, some leasing or licensing arrangements? So what is the breakdown between ownership and management?
So West Virginia is blessed with a little over 1 million acres of national forest. We manage that area under cooperative agreement with the U.S. Forest Service. And then in addition to that, we have somewhere close to a little north of 400,000 acres under our wildlife management area program. And that includes both lands that we own, in some cases fee simple, in some cases we have license agreements with large corporate landowners, and they allow us to manage their property and enroll it in our wildlife management area program. So it's kind of a mix. We also have property that we manage that's owned by the Corps of Engineers, a number of large reservoirs. So it's really a mix of lands that are available for the public.
So on the private property that you have a licensing agreement, how is the fee structure determined for the landowner? I mean, is that a negotiated deal? Is it for a certain term?
So our lease agreements or our license agreements are no cost. We don't provide any revenue to the land holding companies for generating those license agreements. They generally have a term. I think it's 10 years, but I'm not sure. Maybe some may be longer. And those license agreements are done cooperatively with the landowner, they provide for public access to the property, and in many cases allow us to actually do some active on the ground habitat manipulation, as Steve indicated earlier.
I appreciate all that. And so final question, thank you, Mr. Chairman, but if a landowner comes to your group for a 10-year type of license, after that 10 years, what restrictions remain with the property, if any?
So under our license agreement, these are usually done with fairly large land holding companies, timber companies, coal companies, that sort of thing. Once the term of the license agreement expires, that's the extent of the commitment. Generally, though, what we have found is those arrangements are extremely beneficial and positive to the corporate landowners, and they generally renew. There's been a few instances where for whatever reason they've decided to go in a different direction or sell their property or sort of that sort of thing. But for the most part, our license agreements tend to get renewed upon at the renewal date.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Are there further questions of the witness? Seeing none, I believe next is Colleen Scully with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just take a moment to introduce Colleen to you all. Colleen comes to us from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of our Northeast Regional Office, which is headquartered up in Hadley, Massachusetts. Colleen is the Assistant Regional Director up there, and she's charged in chief of the Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program, an incredibly important program for all state fish and wildlife agencies across the country, especially here in West Virginia. We're very proud to call the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a strong partner of ours, and Colleen, a really very dear colleague of mine personally. And so if it would please this joint committee, I'd like to turn it over to Colleen.
Thank you, sir.
Good
And
afternoon.
Agent Scully, thank you so much for being here with us today from the federal government. It's nice. I just realized how that came out. Oh, my face is red now. Oh. For those of you who are wondering what I'm talking about, what was the name of that show? X-Files? That was, yeah, I don't know why I said that, but anyway. Thank you so much for being here. It's always nice to have a guest from the federal government to come and talk to us. And we really appreciate you taking the time to make yourself part of our committee. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's not often I get X-File references anymore, so I can really like sniff out the hardcore X-File fans by these. It used to be I couldn't go through the grocery store without the reference. So thank you. And I really want to thank you all for having me here today to enjoy this beautiful state park and this beautiful facility. I've had the opportunity also to go to a couple of meetings and be a customer at the Canaan Resort as well. And I was telling Paul over lunch that I think there's a lot to admire here in West Virginia regarding your state parks. I live in the state of Massachusetts. We don't have anything like this. And so the idea of being able to go to a state park and have all of these lodging opportunities and ability to enjoy the natural world is really remarkable. So thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm here today to, at the very end of the day, I hope everyone's not too sleepy or feeling like the end of the day, because I'm here to talk about something that I feel really passionate about and am super proud to be a part of, and that is the Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program. As Paul mentioned, I work out of our regional office, which is in Massachusetts, but we cover the entire Northeast region. Here on the map, you can see the Northeast region, which includes West Virginia. I've had the opportunity to work in this program and around these issues for almost 20 years, and most of that time in various capacities with Paul. So it's lovely to be here. I'm just going to ask, is my audio okay? Okay, great, thanks. So here's what I'm going to work on covering today is just to give you an overview of this partnership, the Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Partnership. I want to talk very quickly and briefly about the impact and reach, for which Steve has already talked a bit about. I want to talk a little bit about the requirements associated with the various funding sources that fuel this partnership and some actions that all of us can take to ensure the long-term protection of both the funding coming into the state and also the fish and wildlife resources and the access that's provided through the funding. So a very brief little bit of history to tell you where this all began. In 1937, the state of wildlife in this country was at an all-time low, really decimated. The Dust Bowl had occurred. Fish and wildlife populations were greatly in decline. Americans and Congress were deeply concerned. Out of that concern came the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act, which was funding to conserve and protect and restore wildlife populations in the country. Following that success, through about an 11-year odyssey in Congress, there was a push to have a companion piece of legislation to restore fisheries in this country. That is the Dingell-Johnson Sport Fish Restoration Act. These are sometimes, if you hang out with hunters or anglers, they might talk about PR or DJ. Those are the two pieces of legislation that refer to really what has the funding that has fueled fish and wildlife conservation throughout this country. So I want to just briefly tell you a little bit about how this funding and partnership affects West Virginia and what it does in West Virginia. So existing funding on the land today is responsible right now for conserving and restoring 31 bird species. That's like species of birds that are specifically targeted with the funding, but I can tell you that through the habitat management and through land protection, hundreds of bird species are conserved. And that includes everything from doves, as Steve talked about, to eagles and herons and hawks, to the incredible songbirds that migrate through West Virginia. 25 mammal species, things like elk, bear, deer, of course, and sport fish species, bass, trout, and all of the species that are stocked here for anglers to enjoy. As we've talked about, 1.5 million acres of public access are managed with these grant funds. And in addition, many of those acres were also acquired with the funding. And as Steve mentioned, 31 target shooting ranges for the public to be able to use and enjoy. And Steve mentioned and showed you a lot of pictures, and really what I want to hit home on is that this is this wildlife management area system in West Virginia is a system of conserved and managed lands that have had dozens, even decades of restoration and management work to restore them to provide ideal habitat for fish and wildlife, and has significant improvements on them to ensure that the public can access that for wildlife-oriented recreation. And we're going to talk a little bit in a bit about what that means for wildlife-oriented recreation. I'm sure you are all proud of the elk restoration that has occurred in the state. I want to tell you that I travel across the country, and this is the success story we tell. We tell the success story of more than $6 million in funding from Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Program funding coming here to West Virginia, and that funding being used to plan and to research and to bring the elk to West Virginia, and for the monitoring and the adaptive management work that's occurring, and for acquiring an entire wildlife management area to support that elk restoration. This is wildlife restoration today happening. In addition to the fish and wildlife benefits and the public access benefits, the funding that comes to West Virginia and to the United States overall fuels economic benefits. And these are just some national figures of the economic impacts of fishing, hunting, and target shooting here in the United States. So I want to go into just a little bit of detail about where this funding comes from. So I mentioned in 1937, the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act passed. The funding model associated with that is really unique and different. It's an excise tax on firearms and ammunition. So manufacturers who make firearms and ammunition in this country support and pay an excise tax, and that excise tax goes to a trust fund. That trust fund then comes to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we are entrusted with delivering those funds and supporting state fish and wildlife agencies and putting the fish and wildlife conservation on the ground. The funding is delivered through an apportionment model, and that becomes really important to state fish and wildlife agencies like the Wildlife Resources section here in the DNR, because what it provides is a stable, consistent funding source. So it's the dollars are apportioned throughout the country based on a formula. 50% of the formula is based on the area size of the state, 50% on the number of licenses, that's hunting and fishing, well, in this case, hunting licenses that are sold. And that creates a stable and consistent funding source to state fish and wildlife agencies. So what does that look like in West Virginia? I pulled just a couple of numbers. Paul just mentioned like a $35 million budget for the Wildlife Resources section in federal fiscal year 2022. That's the federal funding coming into that, making up that 35 million was 17.58 million. So really just about 50%. And if we take all of the funding that's come to West Virginia and we adjust it for inflation, it's right at $450 million. And then if you couple that federal funding that's coming in with the state funding, which is going to come in as non-federal match, which I'll speak to in a minute, you're talking about a $600 million investment in fish and wildlife conservation here in West Virginia. It's a tremendous amount of legacy, and it's a tremendous thing to be proud of as West Virginians. So how do Paul and I work together? How does this whole partnership work? And I guess I'll just say that it is truly a partnership in the best sense of the word. Basically, we, the Fish and Wildlife Service, administer the funding. State Fish and Wildlife agencies, like the Wildlife Resources section, prepare grant proposals that they submit to us. They identify the projects that they want to fund, whether it's a significant and important wildlife research project or a survey project, habitat management work, like managing the state's wildlife management area system, or high priority land protection, as you just asked about, to potentially create or add on to existing wildlife management areas. So the way the deal works is 75% of those funds can be, 75% of that project can become through federal grant funds, and then 25% needs to come in as non-federal match. For most state fish and wildlife agencies, including the Wildlife Resources section, most of that match comes through the sale of license revenue from hunting and fishing. Some states get a little bit of general bond money. Sometimes NGOs are bringing in third-party contributions. And so that federal and non-federal money gets rolled up together to create 100% of the funding for each of the grant projects. So I just want to talk a little bit about, in this partnership, what is that state role and what is that federal role? States get to plan, implement, and basically prioritize the projects that they want to fund. Basically, anything that's deemed eligible by our regulation, a state can propose and put forward a proposal. So they plan, they implement, they report on those fish and wildlife conservation projects, and they're responsible for monitoring the effectiveness and adapting and changing based on what they learn or where they need to. And then they make a commitment and they have a responsibility to adhere to all the grant requirements, all those federal requirements that are put in place to ensure that the funding that's coming in is truly invested and that there is a long-term stewardship of those investments. My job and the folks that work with me are to oversee the implementation of the federal laws. Fundamentally, our responsibility is to make sure what was written into statute in 1937 and 1952, which has then been codified in regulations, is to ensure that there's adherence to those laws and that those laws are being delivered on. We do that through establishing regulations and policies and ensuring and then basically enforcing those regulations and policies. We support state agencies in their planning and implementing, but mostly we're responsible for reviewing, approving, and awarding grant funding. We provide a lot of technical assistance. We really try to be not in an oversight manner, but we really try to be a partner and try to help states figure out how to put the funding on the ground that they want to put on and make sure that they can stay within the roads, within the lanes of legality. We come down and we monitor for compliance. We do that through reviewing the performance reports. We do that through coming here to West Virginia and doing field reviews. And then there's also an audit program, which I'll talk about in a minute. And finally, we have the responsibility and the obligation to cease funding in a situation where a state may be in a non-compliance situation. So we continue to ensure that program integrity by, just like you all do here on the state side, we have the federal and state statutes that go along and with this grant funding. Step down from there are federal regulations, and you also have some state regulations that have been put in place that are required by the act, which I'll speak to in a minute. And then further that gets stepped down into federal and state policies. Like as an example, when the question was about offering licenses, entering into licenses or lease agreements, that's a state policy that is keeping in step with the federal requirements. And then, we get all the way down into the state procedures for how they do their work and best management practices. So really we start at the law, we get to regulations, we have policies and procedures and best management practices. And we have a pretty robust training program, and we meet regularly so that we ensure that the regulations that the federal government is passing is workable for state fish and wildlife agencies and are going to give state fish and wildlife agencies the flexibilities they need to deliver the fish and wildlife conservation. Fundamentally, we know that the state fish and wildlife agencies, like the wildlife resources section, are rich and incredibly seasoned employees who are experts in their field and are best able to identify the priorities in their state. So I want to talk just a little bit about a few of the program requirements. This language pulls directly from the law that was written in 1937. And Senator Robertson was a pretty wise guy. And he wrote this specific clause into the statute based on his own experiences in the state of Virginia. And it reads, "And which shall include a prohibition against the diversion of license fees paid by hunters for any other purpose than the administration of said state fish and game department." So that's like written all the way into the law. And really what that says in the most simplistic terms is it says, if you, the state, want to accept these federal funds, you also need to commit to ensuring that the revenue from the sale of hunting and fishing licenses will only be used for the State Fish and Wildlife Agency. So really it's a check and a balance. It says that the money that hunters and anglers are paying are going to continue to go to fish and wildlife conservation, and that's a requirement in order to access these federal dollars. So that steps down into our regulation, and I just want to step through this just a little bit for you because state legislatures have a particular responsibility here. In our regulation, it says states acting through their fish and wildlife agencies are eligible for the benefits of the acts only if they pass and maintain legislation that assents to the provisions of the act. That's what we call the assent legislation, ensures the conservation of fish and wildlife, and requires that revenue from hunting and fishing licenses be controlled only by the State Fish and Wildlife Agency. Here, that's the Wildlife Resources section of the DNR, and used only for the administration of said Fish and Wildlife Agency. So here in West Virginia, as with all 50 states in the country, you have put in place assent legislation in your state statute that assents to and agrees to these provisions. And what happens is if that assent legislation isn't in place, or if the state ultimately takes hunting and fishing license revenue and diverts it to a purpose other than the administration of the State Fish and Wildlife Agency, the state can be declared in diversion. And if you're declared in diversion, that means that you are no longer eligible to receive the benefits under the relevant act. And so really what that means is, in plain English, if for any reason hunting and fishing license revenue is diverted for anything besides the administration of the State Fish and Wildlife Agency or for the purposes of the State Fish and Wildlife Agency, the state will no longer be eligible to receive the federal funds. It's a pretty unique system. And I guess I just want to name what this is, like this idea that these federal funds are coming into states, that those federal funds are derived from the sale of hunting and that they're derived from the manufacturing and attacks on firearms and ammunition, and that those dollars are protected and also nestled in with the license revenue, basically ensuring that the entire cycle is protected and singularly focused on fish and wildlife conservation and providing opportunities for the public to enjoy and experience that wildlife. So very quickly, I just want to go through what constitutes license revenue, because you might think, oh, it's just whatever they collect from the sale of the hunting and fishing license revenue. And that's the simplest part of it. But it also includes permits, fees collected from permits, stamps, tags, and access and use fees, any other state charges to hunt or fish for recreational purposes. it continues even into what the license revenue has been used for. So real or personal property acquired with license revenue continues to be license revenue and must be used only for the administration of the State Fish and Wildlife Agency. It includes even income from the sale, the lease, or the rental, or granting rights to, or a fee to access of any of that lands or property acquired. So basically, anytime a state agency wants to sell something that was acquired with license revenue, all of the income has to be protected as license revenue and be treated as license revenue and used only for the administration of the Fish and Wildlife Agency, here that being the Wildlife Resources section. It also includes interest, dividends, and other income, any reimbursements or any payments received for services that were funded by license revenue. So it's a lot of stuff, and it's a lot of stuff to keep track of, and it's a lot of stuff to protect. And the Wildlife Resources section has some pretty, and the DNR overall has some pretty amazing staff that keeps track of all of that. So I want to talk a little bit about things that can jeopardize eligibility and the ability for this funding to continue to come to states. The first we've already talked about, that's whenever license revenue is diverted for purposes other than the administration of the State Fish and Wildlife Agency, that's going to jeopardize and stop the federal funding from flowing. Spending federal funds on ineligible activities. Our regulation outlines the activities that are eligible and ineligible for funding. If the funds are spent on ineligible activities, that can jeopardize the ability for the funding to flow. And then I'm going to talk about these next two bullets in a little more detail. Losing control of license or federally acquired lands or capital improvements or equipment can jeopardize long-term eligibility. And allowing activities on lands and structures that interfere with grant purposes. And we'll talk about both of those in these next few slides. So I'm getting pretty weedy here, and just stay with me while I get a little weedy, and I'll try to keep it at the highest level for understanding, because it's important. Sometimes you have to get into the weeds to really understand the rules of engagement and the rules of the road that the state agencies and the DNR in particular are responsible for adhering to. So if a grant funds the acquisition of land or water, or if a grant is funding the management of those lands, the State Fish and Wildlife Agency is required to use it for the purposes authorized in the grant. And really what that means is that state agencies, when they acquire these lands, they identify the purposes for which they're acquiring it. And they're making a long-term commitment to continuing to use those lands for those purposes. And when they're managing lands, it's the same thing. They're making long-term investments. They're pouring thousands, sometimes millions of dollars into these lands, and they're making a long-term commitment to manage those lands for fish and wildlife purposes that they've identified at the onset, and also for the very specific types of public access they're identifying. There's a lot of eligible purposes. I just want to highlight the two main ones that tend to impact wildlife management areas. States can use federal grant funds to buy land to restore, rehabilitate, or improve lands and waters as wildlife habitat, or to provide public access for hunting or other wildlife-oriented recreation. So when we're talking about the lands in the wildlife management area systems that are, they're being managed for if it's a PR wildlife funded project, they're required to be managed in a way that is for wildlife habitat and or providing access for hunting or other, again, notice the word, wildlife-oriented recreation. So that's really an understanding that these lands are for wildlife primarily and for the public to enjoy the wildlife on those lands. So it doesn't just say recreation, it says wildlife-oriented recreation. And so wildlife-oriented recreation generally means hunting, wildlife photography, potentially wildlife observation, but done in a way that is protecting and ensuring that the wildlife is able to occur and be relatively unimpeded on that land. Another one of the rules of the road here is around who controls the lands. Our regulations and to participate in the program, state fish and wildlife agencies are required to have management control over all the lands and improvements that are acquired, constructed, or managed with both these federal grant funds and also with the license revenue. And so really what that ensures is that the state fish and wildlife agencies can continue to manage their lands in a way that's appropriate for the fish and wildlife purposes and continue to use their expertise in that. Now, we understand that states may have requests to use their lands for other purposes. And so we have regulations in place that speak to this. It says the state agency may allow commercial, recreational, or other secondary uses of a grant-funded parcel of land or water or capital improvement if these uses do not interfere with the authorized purpose of the grant. So again, we're going back to the fact that these lands had purposes for which they were acquired and managed for, and an expectation that any new use that is commercial or recreational in nature must always first be checked against, will those activities in any way interfere with the authorized purposes? If they will interfere, they shouldn't occur, is the bottom line. And we talk about these uses in a way, when we talk to state fish and wildlife agencies, we remind them that interference is really considered a low bar. And when they're allowing those commercial and recreational uses, to take a very careful look to ensure that those, whatever is being proposed and being considered to be allowed, will not interfere. And I'll talk about a little bit more about how state fish and wildlife agencies do that. So what happens if a state fish and wildlife agency does allow a use of a real property that interferes with its authorized purpose? So the regulation tells the state, you got to stop it. If you allow that to occur, if interference occurs, then you must fully restore the property and get it back to its authorized purpose. And if it can't, for some reason, fully restore the real property to its purpose, then it has to replace the real property using non-federal funds. And I can tell you here in the Northeast region, we've had to go through this in several states, and the ability to replace lands that were bought in the 1930s or 40s or 50s that have had 50 or 60 or 70 years of habitat management to ensure fish and wildlife values, to try to go and find those replacement properties is no easy task. And it is not a situation we want to have any state agencies in. And then if the agency is not able to restore the property to its purpose, then it has to buy that replacement property within 3 years. If it doesn't buy that, if it can't find that replacement property and buy it within 3 years, then the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service can make the state Fish and Wildlife Agency ineligible. So all of this just further the regulation is here to really indicate that these lands are really important. They need to be protected. They need to be used for their authorized purposes. They need to be within the control of the agency, and there's not a lot of room for error there. So when we talk about how do we safeguard those lands, how do we ensure that state agencies like the Wildlife Resources section can continue to be eligible to have these federal funds come? We tell states if they're contemplating new uses on their wildlife management areas, that they need to do a careful site-by-site analysis prior to approving any of those new activities. And we suggest they work through this checklist. What is the funding source? Are there federal funds? Are there license revenue involved in that land? What are those approved grant purposes? Those grant purposes are in the state records, they're in the Fish and Wildlife Services records, and they tend to go parcel by parcel. Each land was bought for very specific purposes around fish and wildlife. What are the short and long-term impacts? Will those impacts affect wildlife populations and their habitat? What are the impacts on wildlife migration? What are the impacts on nesting? What are the impacts on the ability of the wildlife to breed naturally? We encourage folks to think about what are erosion issues that might occur? Will there be noise impacts that could adversely impact wildlife? If you allow a new use, is it going to impede an agency's ability to do future management? Will it adversely impact past management that's been done? Sometimes thousands and thousands of dollars spent on management activities. Will it adversely impact public access? And when we talk about that public access, the existing public access for wildlife-oriented recreation. How will it affect hunters? And then we ask states to remember that they have to maintain management control. So if they allow a new use, how will they ensure they still control the lands in question? And do they have a regulation in place at the state level? Is there a licensing or a leasing or a permitting system? How will the new activity be monitored to ensure that those activities are not adversely impacting wildlife? And most importantly, if you allow it, you need to be able to stop it in case it doesn't go well. So can you cease it? So really what we encourage state agencies when they're contemplating new uses is to walk through a very careful analysis and to do this on a site-by-site level. In addition, all of us have a responsibility for implementing best practices for maintaining eligibility. So Paul does that, Steve does that, every member of his staff does that, I do that, every member of my staff does that. All of you here in the room have the ability to implement best practices to maintain eligibility. So we engage and we educate staff, directors, have the opportunity to talk to all of you about the federal laws and requirements. We encourage states to monitor any proposed legislation to make sure that it won't result in diversion or potentially allow activities that could interfere with those purposes. There's a requirement for careful fiscal oversight, accounting, and record keeping. The Wildlife Resources section just does a tremendous job in this case. Being very vigilant and monitoring and approving grant and license expenditures and activities. So all those dollars, where are they going? Have we made sure that any revenue that is coming from the sale of the license acquired equipment is going back into the license account and is protected? On the lands that make up those wildlife management area systems that are acquired and managed with grant fundings, we encourage states to install signs, mark boundaries, and just take any means necessary to notify the public of land ownership and allowable uses. You might see if you go to a wildlife management area, you'll often see that wildlife and sport fish restoration logo. Again, just telling the public how these lands were acquired and what they're intended for. And to engage early with everyone that has an interest in the land, the users, the hunters, the anglers, the birders, the dog walkers, the municipal officials that might be in the local locality that might have other ideas about how these lands can be used. And of course, as we've talked about, to approve and manage commercial and recreational uses with the utmost caution and carefulness. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the layers of protection and oversight in place. The vast majority of this work around safeguarding the funds and protecting these lands and ensuring purposes are followed is at the state level. State staff day in and day out are managing that as they've sort of stitched these requirements and this monitoring into their everyday program management. In addition, there are state audits and other financial controls in place to ensure that particularly the money continues to be used in the way that it's supposed to. And then, as I mentioned, the Fish and Wildlife Service has a monitoring program in place to come and visit lands acquired and making sure they're being used for those purposes, to check on license accounts, and to ensure only eligible activities are being funded. And then kind of at the very end of the ring, but the last stop is the Office of Inspector General. There is an federal auditing component associated with these grant programs. And that includes every 5 years, each state agency goes through a very intensive audit, and they audit to ensure that license revenue has been adequately protected. There's been no diversion of license revenue, and they audit to ensure that all of the federal funds were used appropriately and in an eligible way. And they audit and have become increasingly interested in the lands. So they go out on all the wildlife management areas, they assess the uses, they ensure that those uses are appropriate and are consistent with authorized purposes, and that the state has that management control. And so I'll just end here to say that the system of state wildlife management areas across the country is really a huge investment in conservation. It's the primary investment in conservation for fish and wildlife and habitat for and providing places for all Americans to connect with nature via hunting, trapping, fishing, and the opportunity to observe wildlife. It's something very unique to this country and something all of us to be uniquely proud of. And I don't know if I have time for questions. It's hard to be at the end of the day.
The gentleman from Mercer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Scully, for being here today. Got 2 questions for you.
Sure.
You talked about a lot of jeopardizing of the programs. Have there ever been that you're aware of any actions that have jeopardized any programs here for projects in West Virginia?
In the past?
In the past.
Yeah. So I will say, let me give an example of an activity that we stepwise that I would say is the model for stepping through very carefully, and that has to do with oil and gas. We did a robust review and analysis with West Virginia as they contemplated oil and gas. Most of the oil and gas that occurs on wildlife management areas, the state Fish and Wildlife Agency, the DNR doesn't own the underlying rights, right? But the way in which they have worked with the oil and gas industry to find ways to ensure that that extraction occurs with the least impact to wildlife has been really impressive. So that's a really great example. Here in West Virginia, I think in past audits, some areas where we've had some challenges that we've had to work through and resolve. I think we had some swimming pools on some wildlife management areas that had to be addressed and resolved that we have through replacement of lands. But I will say West Virginia runs a pretty tight ship. The audits that we see coming out of West Virginia are pretty darn clean. And I give a lot of credit to Paul and his team for really understanding the rules of the road.
Okay, thank you. And then you mentioned that the elk wildlife or the elk program management down there in the southern part of the state was a great program. And I'm curious if there's any other programs that we are not implementing here in West Virginia right now that would be good for West Virginia.
Thanks for the question. I will tell you that the priorities for fish and wildlife conservation and how the funds get used and what are the quote unquote best programs to do, we don't decide. The federal government, like that's a really important key part of the partnership. We don't set the priorities. We don't tell folks what's most important. So I would say that question goes to Paul, but my job is to make sure eligibility happens, not to tell states what to do.
Thank you. The senator from Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, I was looking at the federal grant funding. Is that state matching money required for that grant funding, or is that one-time allocation that comes from the federal government every year? And how's that determination made?
So the 17.5 million of federal funds, like in FY22.
Yeah.
I have a little challenge. I'm not great on math, but so 75% comes from the federal government, 25% non-federal match. So every dollar that makes up one of the projects, 75% of it is federal, 25% of it has to come non-federal. So every dollar, every federal fund has to be matched with some non-state funds.
So it fluctuates every year then?
The amount of federal funding that comes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And the reason it fluctuates is because sales of firearms and ammunition fluctuate. So that's really the biggest piece of what drives the funding up and down is the excise tax revenue. But I will tell you, as of late, if you've been tracking the sale of firearms and ammunition, it's generally on an upward trend.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
The gentleman from the 51st.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would the use of off-road vehicles be an activity that would be allowed?
So what I will tell you is, I don't make any determinations on whether something would interfere or not interfere on my own. So if there was a proposal for a new use on wildlife management areas, we would encourage the DNR to work with us to step through that checklist that I just showed you. So it would depend on where it was being proposed. We would encourage the state to look back at those authorized purposes and to use their expertise to and determine impacts to wildlife. And then we would bring our expertise to the table and we would collaboratively make that decision or determination, I should say, about whether it would interfere or not.
Okay, and some examples were given of activities that improve wildlife habitat. Do you have any examples of activities that would improve fish habitat?
Oh, for sure. I'm sorry. I totally focused on the wildlife side of this. But the activities that are commonly used for sport fish include, obviously raising and propagating fish, habitat restoration around streams, like ensuring that streams have buffers and, of course, woody debris in streams, basically anything that ensures water quality protection. And maybe you wanted to speak more to it. Paul could go into more details. Apologize, we were a little heavy on the wildlife here today.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions of the witness? Seeing none, thank you again so much for being here today and coming all the way from Massachusetts. We're very pleased to have you and thank you for being here. Up next, we have Greg Bailey, the Deputy State Highway Engineer, who's going to talk to us about interstate signage.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to talk a little bit and I'm going to talk about what I understand you all would like to hear a little bit about today. And that is the interstate, as you said, the interstate signage. A lot of people, and I'll probably refer to it as I talk, the blue signs and the brown signs that you see on the interstates, those directional signs. That's what I'm going to talk about here a little bit. The first thing, and I'd like to emphasize, is that those signs that you see on the interstates and expressways are first and foremost not primarily put there for the purpose of advertising. They are put there for the purpose of directional signing. Outdoor advertising is a whole different set of laws. It's an outgrowth of the Highway Beautification Act of 1965. It's one of the most highly regulated industries that you would encounter, and it has a whole set of laws and agreements. As the previous speakers were talking about some of their requirements to receive these federal funds, the Highway Department has over the decades executed agreements and have provisions that allow us to receive federal funds. Just to give you some numbers, about 2 years ago, our federal aid program, just the federal aid that we obligated any given year, was in the range of $475 million per year. Last year, due to the new highway bill that was passed, we obligated almost $700 million in that was our record, obviously. So a lot of that federal aid is tied to following those federal rules and regulations that are started with the Highway Beautification Act. The logo signs, or the blue signs and brown signs that probably a lot of people refer to, are a set of signs that were allowed within that whole set of regulations. And it's the primary purpose of those signs is to provide direction to travelers on the expressway system when it's not obvious where certain basic needs that travelers would have are available. So for instance, you're driving, I mean, most of us have experienced this. We're in a state, we're traveling down an interstate. We're totally unfamiliar with the area. We have no idea what's in the area, and and we need fuel. That's one of the requirements. Fuel, I mean, one of the areas that can participate in is fuel, food, lodging, and camping. So you're a traveler traveling in an area, and you have a need for one of those services, and you're wondering what to do. Well, this logo sign, the blue signs that you see along the interstates, was put in place to try to address those issues. And so there is a set of regulations that go with that to allow businesses in the area of the interchange, working cooperatively with the highway department, to install signs that provide information to travelers who need those four basic services. And there's a whole set of regulations and rules that deal with those particular directional signs. Most people will refer to those as logo signs. A few years ago, there was a fifth category added, which is the brown signs that you see. And there was the acronym that we refer to as TODS. And really what they are tourist-oriented directional signs. So they provide information to travelers who are going into an area, and they, again, not familiar with the area, and they provide information on where some type of a tourist-oriented operation would be. And actually within our rules and regulations, there's a definition for that. What constitutes a tourist-oriented operation. So the main thing I think you need to bear in mind, if you, depending on whatever questions you have, is those logo signs, which are the blue signs, and the brown signs, the primary function of them is not to provide outdoor advertising. They're not intended to be something that everybody in the interchange can have one of those. As a matter of fact, within the rules and regulations, there are limits on the number of those logo signs that you can place in any given interchange. I think it's 6 per each one of those services. And there's actually within the rules, regulations on who gets to put their, if they choose to provide those signs, and it's based on proximity to the interchange. And the point is, again, to provide information to travelers as they're traveling in an area where it's not obvious, where fuel's available, food's available, lodging might be available, or camping might be available. And again, with the brown signs, it's to allow travelers to know exactly where they need to get off to access certain tourist-oriented type services. Now, I can go through all the details of each one of those, or maybe for the sake of time, I could stop there and see if you have any questions. And maybe I've covered what you want. And if you have anything else you need me to cover, I'll certainly try to do that.
The delegate from Kanawha.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So many times. Thank you for this. This is something I'm really interested in. The rules and regulations for the logo signs, are those federal regulations or state regulations?
The overarching rules come from out of federal policy, but the actual specifics are, each state has their own set of regulations, and even down to which sections of the expressway system are eligible, because it is a rural directional sign system. Now in West Virginia, most of our expressway system is rural, but that's not true in some states. Some states have areas, large parts of their interstate, that they're not even eligible for those rural directional signs.
Okay.
So it is West Virginia, but it is federal. It is based on federal provisions and
Okay.
federal code.
So we can change the requirements around who gets to go on the sign, as long as it's like a restaurant. I know how specific they are because I've tried to get some of these done, because I would like to see local businesses on them and not just a million McDonald's, because that's great and good revenue, but I would like our local businesses. So I mean, is there anything we can change to get more local establishments on these signs?
What we would have to do is go back to our federal partners, talk about what you're suggesting, and say, okay, here's what we would like to do in the state of West Virginia. Does it meet all the rules? Now, they do have interstate commerce laws that they have to abide by. So I do not know if they can do preferences like that for local, like for in the case you're talking about, local restaurants. We could ask, but we would have to go to them and say, the legislature is asking if we can put in, I assume what you're talking about is a preference for a locally owned restaurant or
Not
something.
necessarily. I mean, I know how strict the regulations are, and they have to be open so many days a year and so many meals and so many hours a day and have separate bathrooms, and like it's ridiculous.
Now,
So
some of
is that
those.
us or the feds?
Well, okay, now I misunderstood what you said. If you're talking about like how long we may have to be open and
Yes.
things like that, we would need to talk to them. But I'm going to guess that some of those provisions might be easier to deal with than like a preference to a certain
Okay.
restaurant.
And is
But
there
we can
any,
ask.
is there anything stopping us from putting up another sign that is West Virginia branded and it's not blue and it's not brown, and doing our own thing?
That would be a whole separate program that we would have to work with them on. Those two programs I described to you, we just didn't do those. Those were put in place through agreement with our federal highway partners.
Okay,
So, yes.
sounds good. Thanks.
Are there any further questions of the witness? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Bailey, and appreciate you being here. Is there any further business to come before the committee? Seeing none, I'll call on the Senator from Mercer for a motion.
Move to adjourn.
You've heard the gentleman's motion to adjourn. All those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. All those opposed will say nay. It appears the ayes have it, the ayes do have it, and we are adjourned. Thank you.